Corregidor Island, the mouth of Manila Bay, the 3rd of May 1942. Inside a tunnel bored through solid rock, a woman named Gladys Miller is told she has a seat out. She is the chief nurse of the island hospital, and her name sits high on the evacuation list. A submarine has slipped through the Japanese blockade in the dark, surfaced offshore, and it will carry 25 people back toward Australia before the garrison falls. She is one of the 25. All she has to do is walk to the dock and climb aboard, and she will not be a prisoner of the Japanese Empire. She says no. Around her, in the dim electric light of that tunnel, are more than 1,000 sick and wounded men. Some are in traction, their broken limbs slung from frames. Some are missing legs. None of them can walk to any dock. Above her head, the island is being pounded apart. The rock itself shudders when the heavy shells land, and fine dust drifts down from the ceiling and settles on everything, on the bedsheets, on the instruments, on the faces of the men. Outside, the enemy is closing in for the last act, and everyone in that tunnel knows the surrender is only days away, perhaps hours. And Mila cannot make the arithmetic work in her head, the arithmetic that would let her step over those cots and out into the night air and leave them behind. She later put it in the plainest words a person can use. She could not see how anybody could just walk off and leave all those wounded people. She had faith, she said, in that old tunnel. If the Japanese came in, she would make it. She was choosing to become a prisoner of an enemy already notorious for its treatment of captives, rather than take a rescue that would have carried her home to safety, because the alternative was to abandon men who could not save themselves. The general commanding the island understood exactly what she had done. He wrote afterward that he considered it, and still considered it, a truly great act of patriotism. She knew as well as he did that she was signing her own captivity warrant. She signed it. And here is the strange thing, the thing that does not fit the story we tell ourselves about how armies work. Gladys Miller was not supposed to be there at all. Not in a combat zone, not under bombardment, not facing capture. Every assumption the United States Army had built into its own system said that a woman in her position would be gone long before this moment ever arrived. She held only what the Army called relative rank. She was not trained to fight. She was, on paper, a support element, the kind of person a modern army evacuates early and cleanly, well ahead of any collapse. The system said she would never have to make this choice. The system was wrong. And she was only one of 77. 77 American military nurses were trapped in the Philippines in the first months of 1942, 66 from the Army, 11 from the Navy. They would become the largest group of American women ever captured and imprisoned by an enemy. They would spend nearly 3 years in Japanese captivity, starving, treating the sick with almost nothing, watching a camp around them die by the hundreds, and every single one of them would walk out alive. That number is worth sitting with, because it should not be possible. 77 went in, 77 came out. Women with no survival training and no combat instruction, held for the better part of 3 years in conditions that killed the men around them. The historian who recovered their story called it unprecedented, and it is. So this is a story with a puzzle at the center of it, and the puzzle is not really about the Japanese, or about the jungle, or even about the war itself. It is about a contradiction inside the American military. The Army had a doctrine. That doctrine held that these women were safe by definition, too far behind the line to ever be in danger, certain to be pulled out before the enemy arrived. That doctrine failed completely. It left them exactly where it had promised they would never be, and what saved them in the end was not the doctrine, not the plan, not the system that had written them off. It was something the Army had never designed, never ordered, and could not have put on paper if it tried. To understand why the plan failed, you have to understand what the plan actually was, and how sound it looked on the day it was written. In the years before the war, American and British planners made a decision that would shape everything that happened in the Pacific. They agreed that if the United States ever found itself at war with both Germany and Japan at the same time, Germany would be beaten first. The formal language called for the early defeat of Germany and a strategic defensive in the Far East. That phrase, strategic defensive, is a clean and bloodless way of describing what it meant on the ground. It meant that if Japan struck, the American forces in the Pacific would hold on with whatever they already had, and they would not be the priority for rescue. For the Philippines specifically, there was a plan on the shelf called War Plan Orange. In its final form, it assumed that if an enemy invaded the islands, the defending force would not try to hold everything. It would pull back into the Bataan Peninsula and onto the fortified island of Corregidor at the mouth of Manila Bay. There it would hold the harbor and wait. The entire plan rested on a single assumption. It assumed that a relief force, a fleet carrying reinforcements and supplies, would fight its way across the Pacific and break the siege before the defenders ran out of food and ammunition. On paper, it was coherent: hold the peninsula, hold the island, and wait for the fleet. The men who wrote it were not fools, and the plan was not stupid. It had one flaw, and the flaw was fatal. The relief fleet was not coming. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese aircraft destroyed much of the American Pacific battle fleet at Pearl Harbor. The ships that were supposed to steam to the rescue were sitting on the bottom of a harbor in Hawaii, or burning, or crippled. The plan to relieve the Philippines still existed on paper. The means to carry it out did not. And so the garrison in the Philippines, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers, and the nurses among them, were now committed to a plan whose central promise had already been broken before the fighting in their part of the world had properly begun. Consider what that meant in cold terms. The defenders of the Philippines were being asked to hold out and endure, to trade their strength and their lives for time, in service of a rescue that the men at the very top already knew could not arrive. The commander in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur, would himself be ordered out by the president in the middle of March of 1942, slipping away on the night of the 11th aboard a small motor torpedo boat, and then flying on to Australia, leaving the defense in the hands of General Jonathan Wainwright. The garrison would fight on for weeks after their most famous general had gone. Food was already short. From the early days of January, the troops were placed on half rations, and the ration would only shrink from there. Men who were expected to fight a modern enemy were doing it while slowly starving. They did not fully know this yet. Most of them would not understand it for months. They would hold Bataan and Corregidor believing, because they were told again and again that help was on the way, that convoys were being assembled, that they had only to endure a little longer. It was one of the cruelest fictions of the war, and the people who held on the longest believed it the most. The nurses believed it too. They kept working through disease and bombardment on the strength of a promise that the strategy of the whole war had already quietly cancelled. Now hold that strategic picture in your mind and put the nurses inside it, because the gap between what the army believed about these women and what the war actually demanded of them is the whole heart of this story. In 1941, an American military nurse occupied a strange and undefined place in the armed forces. She wore an officer's insignia. She could be called lieutenant. She was saluted, admitted to the officers' club, addressed with the courtesy due an officer, but she held what was called relative rank, and the word relative was doing an enormous amount of work. She did not have the full authority of a male officer of the same grade. In the beginning, she was paid less. She had limited command power, even over the enlisted men who worked in her own wards. The rank was real enough to be useful and thin enough to be a fiction, both at once. Congress had only recently moved to give nurses pay equal to male officers of the same grade. Fuller rank, actual commissions with the authority to match the insignia, would not arrive until 1944, in the middle of the war, and permanent commissions in the regular army would not come until 1947, after it was all over. Navy nurses did not receive even relative rank until the middle of 1942. Think about the timing of that. These women would spend the hardest part of their war, the fighting, the surrender, the first year of captivity, holding a rank that was more courtesy than command, a status the military itself had not fully decided how to define. On the day the war began, the entire Army Nurse Corps listed fewer than 1,000 nurses on its rolls, and the Navy Nurse Corps had around 700. This was a tiny professional cohort about to be thrown into a global war. Most of the women in the Philippines were second lieutenants, and many of them were very young, in their 20s, some only recently out of nursing school. They were not hardened veterans. They were trained professionals in a peacetime service, and the peace was about to end violently. They had not come to the Philippines expecting a war. Quite the opposite. Manila before the war was considered one of the most desirable postings in the entire military, a plum assignment that nurses actively sought out. It was a place of warm tropical evenings and full social calendars, of beaches and officers' clubs and dances, of servants and cheap comforts, and a leisurely pace of duty. Young nurses came for the adventure and the good living. One of them remembered the women arriving looking more like debutantes than military nurses, some of them stepping off the ships in chiffon dresses, dressed for a party rather than a war. The army had sent them to what everyone understood to be a peaceful colonial garrison, and the army's entire conception of what these women were for rested on the assumption that they would stay in that comfortable world. A nurse's place was caring for the sick in clean, orderly hospitals, safely behind the line. If real danger ever came near, the plan was simple and unquestioned. They would be moved out of its way. That was the doctrine, both the written kind and the deeper unwritten kind that lived in the assumptions of everyone, from the newest lieutenant to the highest planner. These women were not combatants. They were non-combatants to be protected, and, if the worst ever came, to be evacuated to safety well before any enemy could reach them. Hold that assumption firmly in mind, because the entire war these women were about to fight would consist of that assumption being shattered, piece by piece, until nothing of it was left standing. That is the theory this story is going to break, because on the 8th of December 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor and on the other side of the international date line, the war arrived in the Philippines, and it did not care in the slightest about any of these assumptions. Japanese bombers hit the American airfields first, because air power was the key to everything that would follow. At Clark Field, the main American airbase, most of the heavy bombers were caught and destroyed on the ground, sitting in neat rows, in a matter of minutes. It was a catastrophe that stripped the defenders of much of their striking power on the very first day. The mountain city of Baguio was bombed, and within hours, the casualties began to arrive at the military hospitals around Manila, burned and broken men, the first flood of a tide that would not stop for months. The nurses who had come to these islands expecting the easy rhythm of garrison duty found themselves, that first day, standing in the middle of exactly the thing the Army's whole conception of their role had promised would never reach them. The acting chief nurse that first terrible day was Josephine Nesbitt, because the senior chief nurse, Maud Davison, had been injured during a night raid. Nesbitt was 46 years old, a farm girl from Missouri, orphaned before she was 12, the seventh of 10 children, with more than 20 years in the Army Nurse Corps behind her. She was tall and calm and enormously experienced, and her nurses called her Mama Josie. On that first chaotic day, with young women shaken by the scale of what had come, she gathered them and gave them an order that was also a kindness. They had to sleep during the day, she told them. They could not weep and wail over this, because they had to work that night. It was the voice of someone who had already understood that the world had changed, and that grief would have to wait for the living. Within days, the war spread down the coast. The great naval yard at Cavite, on the bay south of Manila, was bombed heavily and set ablaze, and the patients and staff of the naval hospital there were pulled back into Manila as the situation deteriorated. And here the first of the deliberate choices to stay behind was made, though it is one of the least told parts of the whole story. 11 Navy nurses, led by their chief nurse Laura Cobb, remained in Manila specifically to care for patients who were too badly hurt to be moved to safety. They could have tried to get out ahead of the enemy. Instead, they stayed with the men who could not travel. Cobb was from Kansas, a small-town woman from Atchison, and she would prove to be one of the most quietly formidable people in this entire account, though nothing in her unassuming manner would have announced it. When the Japanese army entered and occupied Manila, those 11 Navy nurses did not run, and by then could not have been gotten out even if they had wanted to. They were taken into custody, the first of the 77, to fall into enemy hands. From that moment, they were prisoners, and they would remain prisoners for the rest of the war. But they went into captivity together, as a unit, all 11 of them, and together is how they would stay, through every camp and every hardship, all the way to the end. That togetherness was not an accident. It was the first visible thread of the thing that would save them all. Meanwhile, the plan on the shelf was put into motion. War Plan Orange came off the paper and became real. The decision was made to declare Manila an open city, to spare it from destruction, and to pull the fighting forces back into the Bataan Peninsula and onto Corregidor. And so, on Christmas Eve of 1941, the army nurses were loaded up and moved out of the comfortable hospitals of the capital and into the jungle. What waited for them on Bataan were the first open-air ward hospitals the United States military had fielded since the Civil War. 2 hospitals were established in the open. Hospital number 1 was set up first in old barracks and later moved to a place called Little Baguio, and it took the surgical cases, the men torn by shrapnel and bullets, who needed the operating table. Hospital number 2 was, in the most literal sense, built under the trees. Its wards were rows of cots and beds standing on the open ground of the jungle floor, sheltered only by the canopy overhead, expanding as more wounded arrived, by simply adding more rows out into the forest. There were no walls, there was no roof but the leaves. Patients lay in the open air, and the nurses walked the aisles of the jungle between them. The hospitals were built to hold perhaps 1,000 patients each. By the end of March, as the fighting reached its peak, they each held something closer to 5,000 and 6,000. The math of that is worth pausing on. A handful of nurses at each hospital, supported by doctors and Filipino and American medical orderlies, were responsible for thousands upon thousands of desperately sick and wounded men, in the open, in a tropical climate, with the supplies running out. And the conditions defy a modern imagination. Surgical instruments were sterilized in a foot tub of disinfectant and rinsed in alcohol. Gauze was sterilized in a pressure cooker fired by kerosene. Surgical gowns came out of storage, still wrapped in newspaper dated 1917, left over from the last war. Dressings were washed and reused because there were not enough new ones. On the 16th of January 1942, the surgeons and nurses of Hospital Number 1 performed 187 major operations in 24 hours. That was roughly 5 times the surgical load that a comparable American hospital of the day would have considered a heavy day of work. They did it with instruments boiled in a foot tub. The lone Navy nurse serving forward on Bataan was a young woman from Pennsylvania named Anne Bernatitis, an operating room nurse who had come across from the Naval Hospital. She worked with a surgical team through amputation after amputation, as gas gangrene set into wound after wound in the tropical heat, the infection spreading so fast that limbs had to be taken to save lives. She remembered later, in an oral history she gave many years afterward, that she had actually been less frightened on Bataan than she would be later on Corregidor. On Bataan there was at least the open sky and room to move. What came later, sealed in rock under a rain of shells, would be worse. And through all of this the food ran out. The garrison was on half rations from early January, and the ration was cut again, and then cut again. The men were being asked to fight while their bodies weakened. Malaria burned through the patients, and then through the staff, because the supply of the drug that held the disease in check, quinine, was running short and had to be rationed. Dengue fever came, and dysentery, and the swelling sickness of beriberi that comes from a starvation diet. The nurses were treating diseases that they were themselves beginning to suffer from. They grew thin, and then they grew gaunt. They kept working. There was no one else to do it, and the wounded kept coming. There is a discipline in the way they described it afterward that tells you everything about who they were. Nesbitt later said that whatever else happened, first and foremost, they would conduct themselves as members of the United States Army Nurse Corps. Their first duty, she said, was to carry on in their most professional capacity, that of nurses. In a jungle, starving, under a sky that belonged to the enemy, they organized shifts, kept records, changed dressings, and held the line they had been trained to hold, even as the Army's promise to protect them dissolved around them completely. If a story like this one matters to you, the human reality behind the strategy, the people the big histories tend to leave in the footnotes, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of history reach more people who care about getting it right. Now, everything so far has shown you a system failing in slow motion. The plan that promised rescue could not deliver it. The doctrine that promised these women safety had marched them into a jungle hospital under bombardment. But a failing plan is not yet the turning point of this story. The turning point comes when the fighting front finally breaks, because that is the moment the choice becomes unavoidable, and that is the moment you see what these women were actually made of. By late March, the Japanese had brought up fresh troops and heavy artillery for the final push, and the last offensive against Bataan began. The defenders were sick, starving, and very nearly out of everything. And now the war reached out and struck the nurses directly, in the one place that was supposed to be spared. Hospitals are meant to be protected. Hospital number 1 was marked as what it was. It was bombed anyway. On the 29th of March, and then again on the 7th of April, Japanese aircraft bombed Hospital number 1 directly. Patients who were already wounded, men lying helpless in their beds, were killed where they lay. More than 100 people were killed or wounded in those strikes on the hospital. 2 of the nurses were hit. Rosemary Hogan, a nurse from Oklahoma, one of 10 children and the valedictorian of her small-town high school, was struck by shrapnel in the leg, the arm, and the face, and had an eardrum ruptured by the blast. Another nurse, Rita Palmer, was also wounded by the flying metal. These were women who had been bandaging others a moment before, now bleeding themselves. The scenes inside the wrecked wards were horrific. When a ward took a direct hit, nurses ran to the men who were slung up in traction, unable to move, and cut the ropes so that the patients could drop down to the relative safety of the ground, below the level of the flying debris. One survivor of that bombing remembered a detail that captures the sheer violence of it better than any statistic. There were pajamas, she said, hanging in the treetops. The blast had been strong enough to throw clothing, and worse, up into the branches above the shattered hospital. And still the nurses worked, pulling the living from the wreckage, because that was the job, and there was no one to relieve them of it. On the 9th of April 1942, Bataan surrendered. Something on the order of 75,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their arms, sick and starving, and out of ammunition. It was the largest surrender in American military history, and what followed became one of the most infamous war crimes of the Pacific. The captured defenders were forced to march for days up the peninsula in brutal heat, without adequate food or water, and those who fell or faltered were beaten, bayoneted, or shot. Thousands died on that march. The men the nurses had been treating, the ones who could still walk, went into that nightmare. It is remembered now as the Bataan Death March, and it hangs over everything that happens next, because it told every American in the Philippines exactly what kind of captivity was waiting for them. But in the hours before the surrender, an order came for the nurses. They were to leave Bataan and cross the short stretch of water to the island fortress of Corregidor. They were told to carry only what they could hold in their hands. They had to leave their patients behind, the men in the jungle wards, who would now become prisoners. That was its own kind of wound, to walk away from the wounded, and it would not be the last time these women faced that exact choice. And here Josephine Nesbit drew a line that reveals the second theory running underneath this entire story, the one the army never wrote down. The order, as it first came, was that the American nurses would go to Corregidor, and the Filipino nurses who had worked beside them, who had bled and starved beside them, would be left behind. Nesbit refused. If her Filipino nurses did not go, she said, she was not going either. The medical commander relented. The Filipino nurses were included. They all crossed together. That is a small moment in a vast war, easy to miss. But look at what it actually was. The army's system saw the nurses as interchangeable parts, to be moved or left according to a plan. Nesbit saw a group of people bound to one another by what they had endured together, and she was willing to stay and be captured rather than break that bond. The thing that would ultimately carry these women through 3 years of captivity was already visible right there on the shore of Bataan. It was not doctrine, it was solidarity. It was the refusal to leave your own behind, and it would turn out to be far more durable than any plan the army had made for them. They crossed to Corregidor and into the Malinta Tunnel, a great fortified passage bored through the rock of the island, with laterals, side tunnels, branching off the main passage, and a hospital built into some of those side chambers. If Bataan had been the open jungle, all air and leaves and heat, Corregidor was its opposite, a world of stone and electric light and stale enclosed air, deep inside a hill. And it was under a bombardment so heavy that it is difficult to convey. One nurse called the tunnel hospital ghastly. Each time a heavy shell or aerial bomb struck the island above, the shock travelled down through the rock, and the whole tunnel seemed to flinch, and dust sifted down from the ceilings onto the patients and the sterile field and the food. Sometimes the electric power failed without warning, and the whole hospital was plunged into total darkness, so that the staff had to work by the light of flashlights until it came back. The hospital in the rock swelled from around 500 beds toward more than 1,000 as the casualties mounted. The air was foul with the smell of wounds and disinfectant, and too many bodies in too little space. The intensity of the shelling in the final days is almost beyond belief. On the 2nd of May, 2 of the garrison's officers stood and simply counted the explosions striking the small island. They counted at least a dozen bombs and shells landing every single minute, and it went on that way for 5 hours without a pause, adding up to 3,600 rounds, and after that they simply stopped counting. The nurses worked through it, and through the days like it, tending the men, changing dressings, assisting in surgery, in a tunnel that shuddered around them as the fortress was ground down. It was in those final days on Corregidor that the evacuations came, and they are what make the choices in this story so sharp, because a seat on a way out is only a real choice when there are not enough seats for everyone. The army could not get all the nurses out. It knew the island was going to fall, so it tried to save some, and the saving of some meant the leaving of most. The selections were painful. Who goes and who stays is an impossible thing to decide among women who have worked side by side through all of it. In late April, about 20 of the nurses were flown out on Navy flying boats, seaplanes that came in under cover of darkness, touched down offshore, took on passengers, and lifted away toward the south. It should have been clean escape, but the war rarely allowed that. One of those aircraft was damaged while refueling at the southern island of Mindanao, and about 10 of the women aboard it could not continue their journey. They were still in the Philippines when the last resistance there collapsed, and they too were captured, and joined the others in the camps. They had been within reach of freedom and lost it to a cracked hull. Among those who did get away by air was a nurse named Juanita Redmond, who would later write a book about what she had seen on Bataan, an account that reached the American public and reminded it, in the middle of the war, that its daughters and sisters were still trapped and imprisoned on the far side of the world. Her words would eventually help inspire a Hollywood film about the nurses. Then, on the 3rd of May, the submarine came. It surfaced in the dark, having run submerged beneath the Japanese blockade to reach the island, and it would carry 25 people away toward Australia and safety. 11 Army nurses were chosen for those places, along with the one Navy nurse still serving on the island, Anne Bernatitas, the operating room nurse from Pennsylvania. The scene of her departure has survived in her own words. As she was pulled down through the narrow hatch of the submarine into the cramped steel world below, someone told her to get her foot over the rail, and then hands simply pulled her, and the next thing she knew, she was going down into the boat. She was leaving behind the island commander, General Jonathan Wainwright, who would soon surrender the fortress and go into captivity himself, and all the wounded she had worked over. The voyage to Australia took some 17 days beneath and across a hostile ocean. Bernatitas survived it, and she became, in time, the very first American to receive a newly created military decoration, the Legion of Merit. And it was for a seat on that same submarine that Gladys Miller was chosen, the chief nurse of the island hospital, and it was that seat she refused, because she could not walk out past the wounded and leave them. She stayed. On the 6th of May 1942, Corregidor surrendered. The 66 Army nurses who remained became prisoners of war, joining the 11 Navy nurses already in captivity, and the number was complete, 77. Before the end came, in those last days when it was clear the island would fall and captivity was certain, the women in that tunnel did something quiet and profoundly human that has survived all the way to this day. Roughly 69 of them, Army nurses and the civilian women sheltering alongside them, signed their names to a torn piece of bedsheet. It was a record, a roster written on cloth, of who had been there in the tunnel when the end came. The reasoning behind it is heartbreaking in its practicality. If they vanished into enemy captivity and were never heard from again, if none of them survived, then at least this would exist. At least there would be a list of their names, proof that they had been here, that they had stayed, that these particular women had held on to the last. That bedsheet still exists. It survived the war, survived the camps, and is held today in an Army medical museum. It is one of the most affecting objects to come out of the entire Pacific War, a simple piece of torn cloth carrying the signatures of women who fully expected to disappear and who signed anyway, so that they would not be forgotten. As it turned out, every one of them would live to be remembered, but they did not know that when they signed. Now the fighting war they had been trained for, however imperfectly, was over. A completely different ordeal began, one that no part of their training had prepared them for in the slightest, and it is here, in the years of captivity, that the real answer to the puzzle of this story finally emerges. Because the central question is not how these women fought, or how well they nursed under fire, remarkable as that was. The central question is this: how did all 77 of them survive nearly 3 years of starvation and disease, when the men around them, and the civilians around them, died by the hundreds? That is the thing that demands an explanation. And the answer is not luck. Luck does not hold for 77 people across 3 years. The answer is not the mercy of their captors, who let them starve to the edge of death. And the answer is certainly not any plan made in Washington, because the plans made in Washington are precisely what had failed them and put them here. The answer is the thing the Army never designed and never could have. To see it clearly, you have to follow them into the camps. The nurses were taken to a camp in Manila, set up in the buildings and on the grounds of a former university, a place called Santo Tomas. There, thousands of American and Allied civilians, men, women, and children who had been caught in the islands when the war came, were interned behind walls and fences under Japanese guard. It was a crowded, anxious, and increasingly hungry world of its own. Into it came the Army nurses in the middle of 1942, and the 11 Navy nurses were held there as well, before some were later moved south. And here, in this prison, the first pillar of their survival became visible, and it was at once the simplest and the most stubborn thing imaginable. They kept working, and they kept their structure as a unit. In a place designed to dissolve people into a hungry, frightened crowd, the nurses stayed a nursing corps. Maud Davison, the senior Army chief nurse, had recovered from her injuries and resumed command, and Davison was a disciplinarian to the bone. She was older than most of her nurses, a veteran of the previous World War, Canadian-born, and she carried herself with an authority that did not waver, even in a prison camp. She made a decision at Santo Tomas that historians now credit with helping keep these women alive, and it was this. She insisted, through everything that followed, that the nurses remain a functioning nursing unit, not a scattered group of prisoners. A unit. She kept them in their uniforms, worn and patched and faded, as those uniforms became over the years. She set a duty roster, and she held them to it. In a place designed, whether by intent or simple neglect, to strip people of every role and reduce them to hungry individuals competing for the next handful of food, Davison insisted that these women were still officers of the United States Army Nurse Corps with a job to do, and she made them do it. A shift of duty each day, every day, tending the sick and the injured among the thousands of internees in the camp. There was plenty of sickness to tend. The camp population was large and growing hungrier, and disease moved through it constantly. That structure was not a mere formality, not military stubbornness for its own sake. It was a lifeline, and here is why. It gave each woman a reason to get up in the morning. It gave her a place to be, a function to perform, a set of people depending on her. It preserved an identity that the captivity could not take away, the identity of a nurse who was needed. There is a great deal of evidence, from prison camps and disasters of every kind, that the people who survive extreme deprivation are very often the ones who keep a sense of purpose and role, who have someone counting on them, while those who sink into passivity and isolation fade fastest. Davison, without any of that research to guide her, understood it in her bones. She refused to let her nurses become passive prisoners. She kept them working, and the work kept them alive. The second pillar was the bond that Nesbit had defended on the shore of Bataan, and inside the camp it held fast. The nurses looked after one another with a fierce and practical devotion that went well beyond ordinary friendship. When one of them grew too weak or too sick to stand her shift, another quietly took it for her. Nesbit herself, Mama Josie, worked the shifts of nurses who could not, and she scrounged scraps of food and bits of cloth for her girls the way she had done since before the war. They pooled what little they had. They shared food when sharing food meant going hungrier yourself. They watched one another for the first signs of the diseases eating through the camp, the swelling of beriberi, the wasting of dysentery, and they treated each other with the same care they gave any patient. Do the arithmetic of survival. 77 separate individuals, each trying to endure 3 years of starvation and disease entirely alone, would have had far worse odds. Some would have given up. Some would have been overlooked when they fell ill. 77 women who had decided, as a matter of absolute principle, that they would not let a single one of their own fall, were a completely different proposition. They caught each other. That is the plainest way to say it. Every time one of them started to slip, the others caught her. The 11 Navy nurses under Laura Cobb showed what this looked like in its purest and most concentrated form. In the middle of 1943, they were transferred to a new internment camp, being opened at a place called Los Baños, some distance to the south of Manila, and there they were asked to run the camp infirmary. They went as a unit, all 11 together, and they built a working hospital out of very nearly nothing. When they lacked proper beds, they made bed frames from lengths of pipe. When they lacked medical adhesive, they used the sap of trees to hold bandages in place. They fashioned drinking straws from hollow reeds, and mosquito netting, vital in a malarial country, from the fiber of banana plants. They improvised an entire medical facility from the raw material of the jungle and their own ingenuity. Among those who understood what these 11 women were doing, they earned a name. They were called the Sacred 11. Their chief nurse, Laura Cobb, the quiet woman from Kansas, guarded them like a mother. Twice she hid the official service records of her nurses beneath her own uniform, against her own body, to keep them out of the hands of the Japanese authorities. Through everything, she kept her unit intact. Not one of her 11 was lost. Cobb would end the war as the only Navy chief nurse in the history of the service to have led her nurses continuously through captivity from beginning to end. And then, in the final year, came the starvation that nearly finished them all. This is the part of the story that is hardest to hear. As the war turned decisively against Japan and American forces closed in on the Philippines, the food in the internment camps was cut, and then cut again, and then cut once more. The Japanese were losing the war, their supply lines were failing, and the prisoners in their care were among the first to feel it in their empty stomachs. By November of 1944, the daily ration at Santo Tomas had fallen to around 960 calories per person. By January of 1945, it was closer to 700 calories a day. That is a starvation diet by any measure, far below what a body needs simply to maintain itself, let alone to fight off tropical disease. People were eating weeds pulled from the ground. They ate roots, and anything green that might hold nourishment, and whatever small creatures could be caught. The internees were starving to death in plain sight, their bodies wasting, their faces hollowing, and the children among them most vulnerable of all. Of the thousands of people held at Santo Tomas across the years of internment, hundreds died, many of them in that final terrible stretch of hunger. And through it, The nurses kept nursing, though they were starving too, though they could barely stand, because the sick still needed them, and there was no one else. One of the last of the nurses to survive into old age, Mildred Manning, described that final period with a plainness that lands harder than any elaborate account ever could. That, she said, was the year they starved to death. She did not mean it as a figure of speech. She meant that they went to the very edge of death by starvation and lived on that edge for months and watched others go over it. Maud Davison, who had held them all to discipline and duty for nearly 3 years, was by the end so wasted by hunger that her body weight had fallen from around 135 pounds to roughly 80 pounds. She had wasted away to little more than half of herself. She had to be hospitalized the moment rescue finally came, too weak to do otherwise. But the discipline she had enforced, and the bond that Nesbit had defended, and the structure that Cobb had built out of pipe and reeds and sheer will, had done together what no plan from Washington had ever managed to do. It had kept all 77 of them alive, right to the very edge, right up to the moment the Americans came back. Rescue came in the first months of 1945. American forces had returned to the Philippines, fighting their way back across the islands, and as they advanced, they drove hard and fast for the internment camps, because word had reached the high command that the internees were dying of starvation and might not survive much longer if the advance moved at a normal pace. Speed itself became a rescue mission. On the 3rd of February 1945, a flying column of the 1st Cavalry Division raced far ahead of the main advance, a fast armored spearhead punching through toward Manila, and reached Santo Tomas. American tanks crashed through the gate of the compound in the night, and thousands of emaciated prisoners realized all at once that the years were over, that they were saved. The scene that followed was chaos and joy and disbelief. Carl Maidens, a photographer for Life magazine, who had himself been held in that very camp earlier in the war, and now returned with the liberating troops, watched the American flag rise over the main building of the camp, and he wrote that there was more weeping in that moment, from the internees and from the hardened combat soldiers alike, than at any other point in the liberation. Men who had seen everything wept at the sight of these skeletal people and their flag. The army nurses, gaunt and sick, still in the ragged remains of the uniforms Davison had made them keep, were free at last, after nearly 3 years. The 11 Navy nurses at Los Baños to the south had 3 more weeks to wait, and their rescue became one of the most daring and celebrated operations of the entire Pacific War. Los Baños sat behind enemy lines, deep in territory the Japanese still held, and a straightforward advance would not reach it in time. So the Americans went in another way. On the 23rd of February 1945, at dawn, American paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division dropped from the sky over the camp, while Filipino guerrillas and other troops struck the guards from the ground in a precisely timed, coordinated assault. In a matter of minutes, the guards were overwhelmed, and more than 2,000 internees were gathered up and evacuated out from behind enemy lines, many carried to safety across a lake in amphibious vehicles, all of it done before the Japanese could mount a response. It was a nearly flawless rescue, and it is still studied as a model of its kind. As the raid erupted around them that morning, with gunfire and shouting and the sudden impossible arrival of American soldiers, Laura Cobb, the quiet chief nurse from Kansas, gave her nurses one instruction. It tells you everything about who she had been through the whole ordeal. Protect the babies, she said, with all your life. Even in the instant of her own deliverance, her mind went to the most helpless people in her care. All 11 of the Sacred 11 came out of Los Baños alive, and so the count was complete, and it was whole. 77 American military nurses had been taken prisoner in the Philippines. 77 American military nurses came home. Not one was lost to the enemy, to disease, or to starvation, across almost 3 years of the harshest captivity. So we come back to the puzzle, and to the 2 ideas that this whole story has set against each other, because the ending only means what it should if you can see clearly what actually happened here. There was a theory of how the American military would care for these women, and it was written into doctrine and plan. That theory held that nurses were support, safely behind the line, certain to be evacuated before any real danger reached them, protected by the system that employed them. That theory produced War Plan Orange, with its promised relief fleet that could never sail. It produced the comfortable assumption that sent young women to Manila in chiffon dresses. It produced a category, relative rank, that gave these women the insignia of officers and withheld the authority, as if the army itself could not decide what they were. And when the war came, that entire theory failed at every point where it was tested. The fleet did not come, the evacuation did not reach them, the protection was a fiction. The system that promised to keep them safe delivered them instead into the longest captivity endured by any group of American women in the war. And then there was the other thing, the thing that actually worked, and here is what matters most about it. The army had never planned it, never ordered it, and could not have written it down if it had tried, because it was not a procedure. It was a set of human choices, made by individual women, at moments when the plan had nothing left to offer them. It was Nesbit refusing to leave her Filipina nurses on the shore of Bataan, staking her own freedom on the principle that you do not abandon the people who bled beside you. It was Mila refusing the seat on the submarine, choosing captivity by an infamous enemy over stepping across the wounded. It was Davison holding her nurses to a daily duty schedule in a starving prison camp, so that they would remain, in their own minds, people with a purpose, rather than prisoners waiting to die. It was Cobb building a working hospital out of reeds and tree sap and lengths of pipe, and hiding her nurses' records against her own skin. It was 77 women deciding, over and over, in 100 small, unrecorded choices spread across 3 years, that they would not let each other fall. There is a real institutional lesson buried in that contrast, and it is worth naming plainly. A military plan is a magnificent thing for coordinating force. It can move armies and time invasions and calculate supply, but a plan is built on assumptions, and when the assumptions fail, the plan fails with them, and it fails all at once, leaving the people inside it exposed. What does not fail in the same way is human loyalty, the bond between people who have chosen to be responsible for one another. That bond does not depend on the relief fleet arriving. It does not depend on the evacuation working or the ration holding. It generates its own strength from inside, from the simple refusal of one person to abandon another. The doctrine treated these women as interchangeable parts of a machine, to be positioned or removed according to a plan. What saved them was that they refused to be parts of a machine at all, and behaved instead as a living body of people, each one responsible for all the others. The plan assumed safety and delivered captivity. The solidarity assumed nothing and delivered all 77 of them home. That is the whole of it. The system that was supposed to protect them is the system that failed them, and the thing that saved them was precisely the thing no system had thought to require. What the country did with their story afterward is its own quiet lesson, and it circles right back to the contradiction at the heart of everything. For a while the nurses were famous. While the war was still on and their story was useful, America embraced them. Hollywood made a film inspired by them. Their faces and their ordeal helped sell the war bonds that financed the fighting. They were held up as heroines, as proof of American courage and sacrifice. But fame that is built on a wartime need tends to fade when the need is gone, and the deeper, more durable recognition, the kind measured in medals and benefits and official honor, was slow and grudging, and in some cases, it never came at all. The clearest example is also the most damning. Maud Davison, the woman who had held 77 lives together by sheer force of will across 3 years of captivity, was nominated after the war for the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the Army's highest awards. The board that reviewed the nomination turned it down. Their stated reasoning is almost unbelievable given what she had done. They decided she had not acted independently enough to merit it, that she had merely worked under the direction of her superiors. A woman who had commanded a nursing unit through siege, surrender, and years of starvation was told, in effect, that she had only been following orders. It took until the 20th of August 2001, more than half a century after the events, and long after Davison herself had died, before that medal was finally, quietly awarded, secured only because a later generation of army nurses and supporters refused to let the injustice stand and fought to correct it. The recognition came, but it came to a grave. Josephine Nesbitt, the woman they called Mama Josie, went home and did a thing that says as much about these women as any medal ever could. For 49 years, she personally sent every one of her nurses a card on her birthday and another at Christmas. Year after year, decade after decade, one handwritten envelope at a time, she kept the bond alive with her own hands, long after the army had moved on and the public had forgotten, because that bond was the thing that had mattered most, and she was not going to let it die just because the war was over. They asked for very little in the end. Mildred Manning, the last of the angels to die, who lived into old age, said near the end of her life that she had always known that if she could survive that, she could survive anything. That was the gift the ordeal had left them, a kind of unbreakable certainty about their own strength. And notice where that gift came from. It was not something the army had issued them along with their insignia. It was something they had forged for themselves, and for each other, in the one place the system had never planned for them to be. The nurse in the tunnel who refused the last seat out was not supposed to be there. Not one of the 77 was supposed to be there. The entire architecture of American military planning had declared that women like them would be gone long before the enemy arrived. That architecture was wrong, completely and dangerously wrong, and it left them to be captured inside a fortress the High Command had already decided it could not save. They survived it anyway, not because the plan worked, but because when the plan collapsed, they became something the plan had never imagined. They became each other's reason to live, and all 77 of them walked out of it, into the light, and went home. If this account gave you something to carry with you, something about the difference between the systems we build and the people who have to live inside them, then hit the like button and subscribe. It is how stories like this one reach the people who care about getting the history right. Thank you for listening.